across the vast Pacific Ocean, where every wave carried the taste of blood and gunpowder. Another war had begun. Not with atomic fire or flags raised on volcanoes, but through three battles few remember, three that quietly changed the course of the entire war in the Pacific. In May 1942, over the Coral Sea, American carriers faced Japan for the first time and stopped their advance. From the ashes of Pearl Harbor, they rose again, and history began to shift. Months later, on a jungle-covered island called Guadalcanal, U.S. Marines landed on beaches littered with wreckage, marking America's first counterattack in the Pacific. And 3 years later, as the war neared its end, they returned to Luzon, the Philippine soil once lost to Japan, to reclaim it all with blood, faith, and an unbreakable will. This is the story of that journey, from Coral Sea to Guadalcanal, and finally Luzon. 3 battlefields, one purpose, to take back freedom across the Pacific. In the spring of 1942, following a string of lightning victories across the Pacific, the Japanese High Command sought to expand its control even further by establishing a far defensive perimeter to shield the empire from Allied counterattacks. As part of this strategy, the Imperial Navy planned to seize Port Moresby in New Guinea and Tulagi in the Solomon Islands, 2 strategic locations that would allow Japan to dominate the entire northeastern approach to Australia. This resolve grew even stronger after the daring Doolittle raid on Tokyo on April 18, 1942, when Japan's leaders realized they needed to push the range of American operations farther away from their homeland. The Southern Offensive, codenamed Operation M.O., was soon approved, with the ultimate goal of isolating Australia from Allied supply lines. Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue was appointed overall commander of the operation. Confident in their intelligence, the Japanese believed that only one American aircraft carrier was present in the region. To execute the plan, Japan assembled a powerful task force that included 2 heavy carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, both veterans of Pearl Harbor, along with the light carrier Shoho, supported by cruisers and destroyers. However, American naval intelligence had successfully broken Japan's communications codes, uncovering the entire plan. Acting swiftly, Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher gathered a U.S. task force built around the carriers USS Yorktown CV-5 and USS Lexington CV-2 to intercept the Japanese in the Coral Sea. 2 other U.S. carriers, USS Enterprise and USS Hornet, were too far away to join the battle. On May 1, 1942, Lexington rendezvoused with Yorktown. Meanwhile, on May 3rd, Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima's forces landed on Tulagi and began constructing a seaplane base there. The next morning, from a concealed position to the south, Yorktown launched a surprise air raid on Tulagi, destroying the newly established base, sinking the destroyer Kikuzuki and several smaller ships. After the attack, Yorktown withdrew southward to rejoin Lexington. Japan reacted immediately. Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi was ordered to move his main carrier striking force southward from the northern Solomons into the Coral Sea, determined to locate and destroy the American fleet, while Vice Admiral Aritomo Goto continued to escort the Port Moresby invasion convoy. During May 5th to 6th, both sides sent out extensive reconnaissance flights in search of each other, but bad weather frustrated all efforts. From land bases, US B-17 flying fortresses also bombed the Japanese invasion fleet, but with little effect. On the night of May 6th, Admiral Fletcher made a bold decision. He detached a surface force, composed of American and Australian cruisers and destroyers under Rear Admiral John Crace, to move independently toward the Louisiade archipelago to intercept any Japanese approach to Port Moresby. Crace's force would operate without direct air cover from the carriers, a grave risk Fletcher was willing to take to protect the strategic objective. By this point, all forces were in position. Across the vast, rain-swept expanse of the Coral Sea, the stage was set for history's first naval battle in which opposing fleets would clash, without ever seeing each other directly. At dawn on May 7, 1942, the historic confrontation in the Coral Sea finally began. Early that morning, a Japanese reconnaissance plane reported spotting an American fleet to the north. Trusting this signal, Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi immediately ordered nearly 100 aircraft, mostly dive bombers and escort fighters, to launch from the carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku for a preemptive strike. But as they approached and began their dives, the Japanese pilots were stunned to discover that the enemy fleet was in fact only the oiler USS Neosho and her escort, the destroyer USS Sims, not the American carriers they had been told to expect. Still, the attack continued relentlessly. Bombs rained down from above. USS Sims was struck multiple times, broke apart, and sank quickly, taking nearly her entire crew with her. USS Neosho was also hit repeatedly, erupting into flames and drifting helplessly for days before finally sinking on May 11th, after the destroyer USS Henley rescued the few survivors. The Japanese strike that morning had expended most of its power on secondary targets, leaving the American carriers completely untouched and still hidden from view. At the same time, U.S. forces had also launched their own air attack in search of the Japanese fleet. However, due to faulty reconnaissance reports, the American squadrons initially flew off course and missed the main enemy carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku. On their return flight, they happened upon a Japanese surface group below, the invasion force protected by the light carrier Shoho. Without hesitation, 53 dive bombers, 22 torpedo bombers, and 15 F-4F Wildcat fighters from the carriers USS Lexington and USS Yorktown swooped down in a coordinated assault. Within minutes, Shoho was struck by at least 7 torpedoes and 13 bombs. The ship shuddered, engulfed in flames, and sank at 8:35 a.m., taking 631 officers and crew to the bottom. Her captain, Kyoto Izawa, and about 200 survivors were later picked up by the destroyer Sazanami. It was a historic moment, the first Japanese aircraft carrier ever sunk in the Pacific War. When news of the victory reached the fleet, Pilot Lieutenant Robert E. Dixon aboard the USS Lexington radioed a jubilant message that would become legendary: "Scratch one flat top." The destruction of Shoho shattered Japan's illusion of an invincible defensive perimeter and gave the Allies a powerful surge of morale after months of crushing defeats. On the afternoon of May 7, 1942, Rear Admiral John Crace's surface task force, consisting of the cruisers HMAS Australia, HMAS Hobart, USS Chicago, and several destroyers, was patrolling to block any Japanese approach toward Port Moresby when it suddenly came under heavy attack by Japanese torpedo bombers launched from Rabaul. The Allied ships quickly broke formation, maneuvering skillfully while filling the sky with anti-aircraft fire. Their evasive action worked. They suffered only minor damage and narrowly avoided disaster. Moments later, confusion struck again, this time from their own side. A formation of US B-17 Flying Fortress bombers, flying overhead in poor visibility, mistakenly identified Crace's ships as Japanese and dropped their bombs on them. Fortunately, all bombs missed, causing no casualties, but leaving the fleet shaken and painfully aware of how chaotic carrier warfare could be. Meanwhile, farther east, the Japanese carrier force prepared to strike back. Late that afternoon, the still undetected carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku launched 27 aircraft, a mix of bombers and torpedo planes, to search for the American carriers. But their approach was intercepted by F-4F Wildcat fighters from USS Yorktown and USS Lexington. A fierce dogfight erupted, and within minutes, 9 Japanese planes were shot down while the rest were forced to jettison their bombs and retreat without inflicting any damage. As darkness fell, another bizarre incident unfolded. A group of lost Japanese bombers trying to return to base mistook the USS Yorktown for a Japanese carrier and attempted to land on her deck. The ship's gunners opened fire to warn them off, sending the startled planes veering away into the night. Minutes later, 3 more Japanese aircraft appeared. This time, the Americans hit one, sending it flaming into the sea. After these deadly mistakes, the remaining planes dispersed and withdrew. The first day of battle ended with a clear Allied advantage. 1 Japanese carrier destroyed, every enemy attack repelled, and the U.S. fleet still intact for the coming showdown. At dawn on May 8, 1942, the climax of the Battle of the Coral Sea began. At 6 a.m., a reconnaissance seaplane from USS Lexington sighted the Japanese carriers several hundred kilometers away. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher immediately ordered a full-scale strike. Every remaining F-4F Wildcat, SBD Dauntless, and TBD Devastator aboard Lexington and Yorktown launched to attack. Almost simultaneously, the Japanese commander, Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi, located the American fleet and responded in kind, sending nearly all the aircraft still available on Shokaku and Zuikaku toward the U.S. carriers. By 10 a.m. to 11 a.m., both strike groups reached their targets nearly simultaneously, with the 2 fleets only about 175 nautical miles, 320 kilometers apart. Aboard the warships, alarms blared, sailors rushed to battle stations, and the sea erupted in fire. High above the Coral Sea, American and Japanese pilots clashed in deadly duels. Wildcats tangled with Mitsubishi A-6M-0s, while below, both sides' carriers zigzagged frantically to dodge torpedoes. Anti-aircraft guns thundered, filling the sky with exploding shells. Some Japanese bombers broke through the U.S. defenses to release their torpedoes, while American pilots braved fierce enemy fire to dive on Shokaku and Zuikaku. When the smoke cleared, both fleets had taken heavy blows, and the battle that would decide the fate of the Coral Sea was reaching its bloodiest point. On the Japanese side, the carrier Shokaku became the primary target for American pilots. At least 3 bombs scored direct hits, tearing through her flight deck and igniting massive fires that rendered the ship incapable of launching or recovering aircraft. The other carrier, Zuikaku, managed to evade detection by hiding within a sudden rain squall and escaped unscathed. Badly damaged, Shokaku listed heavily and withdrew from the battle under escort, her decks strewn with wreckage and her crew suffering heavy losses. 108 sailors killed and 40 wounded. Zuikaku and her escorts had no choice but to accompany the crippled carrier away from the combat zone, abandoning any further offensive action. Meanwhile, the Japanese strike groups reached the American fleet and unleashed their own fury. Despite losing 17 planes to the defending F-4F Wildcat fighters patrolling the outer perimeter, several Japanese bombers broke through and attacked from multiple directions. At 11:20 a.m., Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers dropped their torpedoes from both sides of the USS Lexington, scoring 2 hits on her port side. The carrier shuddered violently. Almost simultaneously, 3 250-kilogram bombs from Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers struck the flight deck, detonating with deafening blasts that sent pillars of flame and black smoke high into the air. Lexington heeled over 7 degrees to port, her elevators jammed, and raging fires swept through the lower hangars. The legendary Lady Lex was mortally wounded. At the same time, the USS Yorktown came under intense attack. With exceptional skill, her captain, Elliot Buckmaster, maneuvered the ship to evade all 8 torpedoes aimed at her. Moments later, another wave of Val dive bombers descended from above. Yorktown dodged most of their bombs, but one scored a direct hit near the stern, penetrating the flight deck and exploding in the hangar below. The blast ignited several fires and killed or wounded 66 crewmen. Despite the damage, Yorktown maintained speed and operational capability, thanks to her crew's quick firefighting response that brought the blaze under control. By the afternoon of May 8, 1942, Lexington was still burning fiercely. Around 1 p.m., through heroic effort, her crew managed to contain the flames and restore stability, keeping her moving at 25 knots. But fate was not done with her. Without warning, a massive internal explosion ripped through the ship. Gasoline vapors had ignited deep inside. The fires raged out of control, consuming her from bow to stern. At 5 p.m., after all efforts to save the ship had failed, Captain Frederick C. Sherman gave the fateful order: abandon ship. Nearby cruisers and destroyers rushed in, rescuing over 2,700 crewmen, though 216 officers and sailors perished with their ship. Still aflame and refusing to sink, Lexington drifted helplessly in the waves. Finally, to prevent her from falling into enemy hands, the destroyer USS Phelps closed in and fired 5 torpedoes into her hull. At 7:56 p.m., with a thunderous explosion, the once proud Lady Lex slipped beneath the dark waters of the Coral Sea, a tragic but heroic end to one of America's most famous carriers. That evening, the Japanese command assessed the situation. Though they had succeeded in sinking one U.S. carrier, they themselves had suffered severe damage and no longer possessed the air strength to cover their invasion force. Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue, overall commander of Operation MO, decided to cancel the planned invasion of Port Moresby and ordered an immediate withdrawal from the Coral Sea to preserve his remaining ships. The decision enraged Combined Fleet Commander Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who demanded that Inoue press the attack and destroy the remaining American carriers. He instructed Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi to pursue the U.S. fleet southward, but after 2 days of fruitless searching on May 9th and 10th, Takagi found nothing. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher had already withdrawn his task force under orders. On the night of May 10th, 1942, the remaining Japanese warships turned north, officially ending the campaign. After 4 days and nights of fierce combat, the Battle of the Coral Sea, the world's first naval battle fought entirely by aircraft, with opposing fleets never seeing each other, came to a close, marking the dawn of a new era in modern naval warfare across the Pacific. The Battle of the Coral Sea, May 4th to 8th, 1942, ended with heavy losses on both sides, marking a major turning point in the history of naval warfare. The Imperial Japanese Navy lost the light carrier Shoho and 1 destroyer. The fleet carrier Shokaku was severely damaged and forced to withdraw from combat. In total, 69 aircraft were destroyed. The U.S. Navy, meanwhile, suffered the loss of the fleet carrier USS Lexington, the destroyer USS Sims, and the large oiler USS Neosho. The fleet carrier USS Yorktown sustained serious damage, and about 65 American aircraft were destroyed. After the battle, both Tokyo and Washington hastily claimed victory, each exaggerating the enemy's losses for wartime propaganda purposes. Yet when viewed strategically, the Battle of the Coral Sea represented the first major Allied victory in the Pacific theater during World War II. Although the U.S. Navy had taken heavier tactical losses, it had successfully halted Japan's southward expansion, forcing Tokyo to cancel the planned invasion of Port Moresby and abandon its bid to threaten Australia. Japan's once unbroken offensive momentum, which had swept across the Pacific since Pearl Harbor, was finally stopped. The battle restored a measure of initiative and confidence to the Allies after nearly 6 months of constant retreats and defeats. The consequences of the Coral Sea battle proved far-reaching. The Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, both heavily damaged or short of aircraft, were unable to participate in the Battle of Midway just 1 month later. In contrast, the damaged USS Yorktown was repaired at record speed. returning to service in time for Midway, where she and other U.S. carriers sank 4 of Japan's fleet carriers, delivering a decisive blow that changed the course of the Pacific War. By halting Japan's advance, safeguarding Australia, and setting the stage for the Allied counteroffensive, the Battle of the Coral Sea became widely regarded as the glorious prelude to Midway, the true turning point of the Pacific conflict. The Battle of the Coral Sea ended with heavy losses on both sides, but for the Americans it was more than just a draw. It was a signal. For the first time, the Imperial Japanese Navy had been stopped. Their momentum was broken, and in that fragile pause, opportunity appeared. In the war rooms of Hawaii, Admiral Nimitz and his officers knew one truth. The war could not be won by defense alone. They had to strike back. And the first target of that counterattack was a name few had ever heard: Guadalcanal. There, young American soldiers would step into the real hell of the Pacific War. In the summer of 1942, after the Japanese Empire's initial lightning victories across the Pacific, the balance of the war began to shift. In May, at the Battle of the Coral Sea, the U.S. Navy halted Japan's advance, and just a month later, at Midway, they achieved a decisive victory that shattered Japan's carrier supremacy, the backbone of its fleet. These successes opened the door for the Allies to seize the initiative for the first time. Against this backdrop, Allied military leaders resolved to launch their first counteroffensive against enemy strongholds. The chosen target was the Solomon Islands, particularly Guadalcanal, where the Japanese were hastily constructing an airfield that could threaten the vital sea lanes linking the United States with Australia. The landing operation, codenamed Watchtower, was quickly drawn up, with the critical mission of capturing Guadalcanal and nearby islands to halt Japan's expansion. This marked the Allies' first major offensive after months of retreat and passive defense. At dawn on August 7, 1942, the Allied fleet closed in on the shores of Guadalcanal and nearby islands under the cover of stormy weather, avoiding detection by the Japanese. Exploiting the element of surprise, nearly 19,000 U.S. Marines of the 1st Marine Division under Major General Alexander Vandegrift stormed ashore. On Tulagi and the smaller surrounding islands, the Japanese garrisons fought fiercely, but were ultimately wiped out or scattered. On Guadalcanal itself, only about 2,000 Japanese soldiers and laborers were present, working on an unfinished airfield. Caught off guard, they fled into the jungle. Within just 2 days, the Americans secured Guadalcanal along with the incomplete airstrip at Lunga Point. The position was quickly fortified into a defensive bridgehead, and the airfield was named Henderson Field in honor of a Marine pilot killed at Midway. Securing Henderson was of vital importance, as it allowed the Allies to control the skies and seas around the island. Japan's response was swift. On the night of August 8th to 9th, as Allied transport ships were still unloading supplies on the beaches, a Japanese task force of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer under Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa launched a surprise attack near Savo Island. In a chaotic half-hour night battle, later known as the Battle of Savo Island, the Japanese struck a devastating blow, sinking 4 Allied cruisers, 3 American and 1 Australian, and heavily damaging another, while suffering almost no losses themselves. It was the worst naval disaster in U.S. history up to that time. Fearing daylight airstrikes, however, Mikawa withdrew before destroying the vulnerable Allied transports. Even so, the heavy losses forced Admiral Turner to pull the Allied fleet out of Guadalcanal on August 9th, abandoning roughly 11,000 Marines on the island. They now faced a desperate situation, short on heavy weapons, with only 2 weeks' worth of food, and reduced to 2 meals a day. Despite being left alone, the Marines quickly dug in, establishing a defensive perimeter around Henderson Field at Lunga Point. During the first week, they dragged artillery and supplies inland while rushing to complete the runway with captured Japanese equipment. Remarkably, within just 4 days, Henderson was operational. On August 20th, the escort carrier USS Long Island secretly approached and delivered 31 aircraft, Wildcat fighters, and Dauntless bombers to the airfield. This composite unit, nicknamed the Cactus Air Force after the Allied codename for Guadalcanal, immediately entered combat, shooting down Japanese planes and providing crucial support to ground forces. With their help, U.S. troops repelled Japanese probing attacks near the Matanikau River and even sank a small transport carrying 113 Japanese troops attempting to land west of the Lunga perimeter. Yet hardship pressed in from all sides. The tropical diseases began to take their toll. Within weeks, 1 in 5 Marines had contracted dysentery. Supplies were scarce, the climate harsh, and the men battled swarms of mosquitoes alongside the enemy. Everyone knew the fiercest trials on Guadalcanal were still to come. Determined to retake Guadalcanal, the Japanese High Command immediately launched a counteroffensive. On the night of August 18, 1942, the first detachment of about 900 infantrymen from the Ichiki Regiment, under Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, was secretly landed by destroyers on the island's eastern shore, roughly 35 kilometers from Henderson Field. Although ordered to reconnoiter and await reinforcements, Ichiki, overconfident and eager for glory, led his men through the jungle and reached the American defenses along Alligator Creek at dawn on August 21st. There, he recklessly ordered a direct banzai charge. The initial surprise was quickly shattered as the Marines' overwhelming firepower cut the attackers down. By daylight, the Americans counterattacked with tanks and artillery, annihilating the remnants on the sandbar at the river mouth. The Battle of Tanaru ended in catastrophe for the Japanese. Nearly the entire unit was destroyed, with only a few dozen survivors retreating. Colonel Ichiki himself was killed, reportedly by suicide after witnessing his regiment's destruction. This first clash at Guadalcanal proved that U.S. Marines could decisively defeat Japanese infantry in the jungle, shattering the myth of the Empire's invincibility. Almost immediately after Tanaru, Japan prepared a larger campaign to reclaim the island. In late August, convoys from Rabaul sailed south with reinforcements, while the U.S. Pacific Fleet, under Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, deployed the carriers USS Enterprise and USS Saratoga with their escorts to intercept. On August 24, 1942, the two forces clashed in the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. In the fierce carrier battle, Japan's light carrier Ryujo was sunk, while Enterprise suffered heavy bomb damage and had to withdraw to Hawaii for repairs. Japan's transport plans collapsed after one supply ship was destroyed, and Admiral Tanaka's flagship Jinsu was damaged. The following morning, August 25th, dive bombers flying from Guadalcanal pursued the Japanese convoy, sinking the destroyer Mutsuki and forcing Tanaka to retreat. As a result, Japan failed to land significant reinforcements on Guadalcanal throughout August, giving the Americans valuable time to strengthen Henderson Field. From late August into September 1942, the campaign settled into a tense stalemate. Each night, Japanese destroyers, dubbed the Tokyo Express by the Allies, raced in under cover of darkness to land troops and bombard Henderson Field, withdrawing before dawn. By day, the Cactus Air Force and American artillery struck back, targeting Japanese positions, aircraft, and warships. The stretch of water between Guadalcanal and Florida Island soon earned the name Iron Bottom Sound, as dozens of ships from both sides went to the bottom in savage naval battles. On land, U.S. forces launched repeated probes and small offensives westward, clashing with Japanese units along the Matanikau River. The jungle terrain, relentless tropical weather, and rampant malaria gradually drained the strength of both armies. On September 15th, disaster struck the U.S. Navy when the carrier USS Wasp was torpedoed and sunk by a Japanese submarine while returning from escort duty. Still, Allied resolve held firm. Both sides braced for the larger, decisive battles that would determine the fate of Guadalcanal. In mid-September 1942, Japan launched its first major ground counteroffensive aimed at breaking the American perimeter around Henderson Field. General Kiyotake Kawaguchi assembled about 6,000 elite troops from the 35th Infantry Brigade and secretly marched them through the jungle from the south. On the night of September 12th, flares lit up the dark sky as the assault began. The Japanese charged furiously toward Edson's Ridge, a vital hill guarding the southern approach to Henderson, defended by just 800 U.S. Marines of the 1st Raider Battalion under Colonel Merritt Red Mike Edson. The Battle of Edson's Ridge, later called Bloody Ridge, quickly turned into a fight for survival. For 2 nights, September 12th to 14th, savage combat raged in the pitch-black tropical jungle. Japanese troops repeatedly broke through the lines, reaching halfway up the hill amid a chaos of gunfire, grenades, and shouted charges. The Marines held on desperately, often fighting to the last man. Many positions were overrun and retaken several times in a single night. At dawn on the 14th, American reinforcements sealed the gaps and counterattacked, driving the Japanese down the slopes. By midday, the ridge was littered with bodies. Over 600 Japanese lay dead, compared to just 40 U.S. Marines. Once again, Japan's attempt to seize Henderson ended in failure. The victory lifted Allied morale, and Colonel Edson was awarded the Medal of Honor for his leadership. For the Japanese, the bitter defeat underscored that retaking Guadalcanal would require far greater numbers and determination. After Edson's Ridge, both sides pulled back to regroup and prepare for a decisive confrontation. In October 1942, Japan poured massive reinforcements into the Guadalcanal Gamble, dispatching the 2nd Infantry Division and other elite units, raising their strength on the island to about 30,000 men by the end of the month. The Americans also reinforced. Though exhausted, the 1st Marine Division held on, supported by the arrival of the 7th Marines, engineers, artillery, and, on October 13th, the U.S. Army's 164th Regiment of the American Division, the first regular Army unit to fight on Guadalcanal. At sea, Japan continued bold strikes. On the night of October 11th, a Japanese surface force approached to bombard Henderson, but was intercepted at Cape Esperance by Rear Admiral Norman Scott's U.S. task force. In the ensuing night battle, the Americans won their first clear naval victory, sinking a cruiser and a destroyer and forcing the rest to retreat. Though small in scale, it marked a turning point in Allied naval confidence. Yet just 2 weeks later, on October 26th, Japan struck back in the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. Exploiting the fact that only USS Enterprise remained in service, Vice Admiral Nagumo launched his main carrier force, including Shokaku and Zuikaku. In the battle, USS Hornet was sunk, and Enterprise was heavily damaged, but the Japanese lost dozens of aircraft and many veteran pilots. Tactically, Santa Cruz was a temporary Japanese victory. The U.S. Navy was left without operational carriers in the area. Strategically, however, Japan had failed again to eliminate Henderson Field or crush the American foothold. The defenders held firm, reinforcements kept coming, and the struggle for Guadalcanal was now entering its most decisive and brutal phase. By late October 1942, Japan's 17th Army under General Harukichi Hyakutake launched its largest offensive of the campaign, determined to overrun the defenses around Henderson Field. Over 15,000 Japanese troops advanced in multiple columns, moving under cover of darkness from both the west and the south. On the night of October 24th, the assault began. To the west, some 2,000 men, supported by tanks, tried to cross the Matanikau River, but blundered into an ambush. American artillery and anti-tank guns destroyed nearly all the armor, breaking the attack. The decisive fighting came on the southern front, where nearly 3,000 men of Japan's 2nd Infantry Division, commanded by General Masao Maruyama, struck the thin defenses of the U.S. 1st Battalion, 7th Marines. Only about 700 Marines under Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller held the line against an enemy many times their number. For 2 nights, October 24th to 25th, the battle raged with brutal intensity. Marine positions fought in isolation, but held firm, led by steadfast non-commissioned officers like Sergeant John Basilone, who would later be awarded the Medal of Honor for mowing down hundreds of attackers during the night. Flares, mortars, and machine guns lit up the jungle. Japanese dead piled up before the trenches. By dawn on October 26th, the final assaults had been repulsed, leaving thousands of Japanese casualties. Reinforcements from the U.S. Army's 164th Regiment arrived just in time to strengthen the line, joining the Marines in holding Henderson Field. The clash ended in a decisive American victory. At least 1,500 Japanese were killed, crippling the combat strength of the 17th Army. From that point forward, Japan would never again mount a major ground offensive on Guadalcanal. The defeat plunged Japanese command into a grim dilemma. Their finest units had been thrown into the meat grinder of Guadalcanal, yet they had failed to breach Henderson's defenses. In the skies, the Cactus Air Force maintained daytime supremacy, thwarting raids and blocking supply runs. On the ground, Japanese troops starved and sickened. Supply ships were sunk by American planes, forcing men to survive on weeds and muddy water. Many collapsed, not from bullets, but from malaria and exhaustion. In November, sensing the tide turning after the defensive victory, the Allies prepared to finish the campaign. General Alexander Vandegrift was replaced by General Alexander Patch, commander of the U.S. Corps and American strength on the island swelled to more than 44,000 men as reinforcements poured in. Japan, however, refused to give up. In early November, the Imperial General Headquarters ordered an all-out effort, coordinating Army, Navy, and Air Forces. A massive convoy would attempt to land reinforcements, while a powerful fleet steamed toward Savo Island to engage the U.S. Navy and bombard Henderson Field into rubble. The naval battle of Guadalcanal, fought from November 12 to 15, 1942, was the bloodiest climax of the entire campaign. On November 12th, American intelligence detected a convoy of 11 Japanese transports carrying about 7,000 troops and heavy weapons toward the island. Protecting them was a formidable force, including the battleships Hiei and Kirishima, along with cruisers and destroyers ordered to bombard Guadalcanal during the night of November 12th to 13th. U.S. aircraft attacked throughout the day, but failed to prevent the Japanese from advancing. With the situation dire, Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan was ordered to intercept with a hastily assembled group of cruisers and destroyers. Shortly after midnight on November 13th, the two fleets collided in the darkness off Guadalcanal at point-blank range. Ships intermingled chaotically, firing guns and launching torpedoes at just a few hundred meters. In only 24 minutes of savage fighting, the Americans managed to block the Japanese advance, but at terrible cost. The battleship Hiei was crippled and later sank in Iron Bottom Sound. The U.S., however, lost 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers, with several others badly damaged. Both Admirals Callahan and Norman Scott were killed in action. Yet the sacrifice forced Japan to abandon its planned bombardment of Henderson Field that night. On the morning of November 13th, while the Japanese surface fleet withdrew, Allied aircraft swarmed over the convoy, dive bombers and B-17s pounding the transports and sinking most before they could reach Guadalcanal. The following night, November 13th to 14th, Japanese cruisers attempted a brief bombardment of Henderson, but inflicted little damage. On the night of November 15th, Japan made one final desperate effort. Admiral Kondo led Kirishima and an escort force into the strait between Guadalcanal and Savo Island. This time, the Americans were ready. Admiral Willis Lee lay in ambush with the battleships USS Washington and USS South Dakota. Near midnight, the two sides clashed. The 16-inch guns of Washington delivered devastating blows, setting Kirishima ablaze and sinking her within hours. The heavy cruiser Kinugasa was also sunk by air attack. The U.S. lost 3 destroyers to torpedoes, and South Dakota was heavily damaged, but the Japanese fleet was decisively repulsed. By dawn, the surviving 4 transports were either sunk by American aircraft or deliberately run aground. Thousands of Japanese troops were killed at sea, while most survivors who reached shore were too exhausted and starving to fight. The victory in mid-November ended Japan's last hope of reinforcing Guadalcanal. By December 1942, the balance of power had completely shifted in favor of the Allies. Japan could only cling on in desperation. U.S. naval and air forces dominated the Solomon skies and seas, cutting off supplies entirely. On land, American troops launched steady attacks to squeeze Japanese strongholds in the island's west, winning brutal clashes around the Gifu Strongpoint, Mount Austin, and the village of Tassafaronga. Though the Japanese resisted fiercely, American firepower and reinforcements steadily crushed them. After more than 5 months of attrition, Japan's high command finally accepted reality. On December 31st, Emperor Hirohito approved the evacuation of Guadalcanal. Operation K, the withdrawal plan, was carried out in secrecy in late January 1943 under the cover of remaining naval forces. On the night of February 7th, the last Japanese troops slipped away aboard destroyers. At dawn on February 9th, U.S. forces occupied the remaining positions without resistance. After 6 months of relentless combat, the Guadalcanal campaign officially ended. The Allies had secured their first major strategic victory against the Japanese Empire in the Pacific War. The Battle of Guadalcanal was one of the decisive turning points of World War II, but the price of victory was staggering. The Allies suffered around 7,000 dead. The United States alone lost more than 1,600 men and had over 4,200 wounded on land, not including the heavy toll at sea and deaths from disease in the tropical jungle. Japan's losses were far greater. An estimated 24,000 soldiers, sailors, and elite pilots perished on Guadalcanal. Tragically, many did not fall to bullets or bombs, but to starvation, malaria, and exhaustion. The material losses were equally devastating. Each side lost roughly 20 warships over the course of the campaign. The Japanese Navy left beneath the waters of Iron Bottom Sound the battleships Hiei and Kirishima, a light carrier, 4 cruisers, 11 destroyers, and numerous submarines. The Allies, too, paid dearly, losing the carriers USS Wasp and USS Hornet, 8 cruisers, and 14 destroyers. In the skies, over 600 aircraft were destroyed or shot down. Guadalcanal became a massive graveyard of men and machines, so much so that soldiers from both sides called it the Island of Hell. Yet behind the enormous sacrifice lay a strategic victory of historic importance. For the first time, the Allies not only repelled, but decisively defeated a major Japanese offensive on land, while also blunting their power at sea and in the air. After Guadalcanal, Japan was forced to relinquish the strategic initiative and shift to the defensive across the Pacific. For the United States and its allies, what had begun in weakness now turned into strength. Guadalcanal provided a secure foothold for launching the island-hopping offensives that would gradually reclaim territory from Japanese control. The tragic last station of Japan's imperial advance entered history not only as a symbol of ferocity and loss, but also as proof of the resilience and sacrifice of tens of thousands of men. It opened the long, grueling, but ultimately victorious road to liberating Asia and the Pacific from Japanese militarism. After 6 brutal months on Guadalcanal, the Americans finally held the island. The cost was thousands of lives. But that victory proved one thing: the Japanese Empire could be defeated. From that moment, the United States adopted a new strategy: island hopping. Step by step across the Pacific, they would seize one island after another, pushing the Japanese army back toward its homeland. 3 years later, that long campaign brought them back to a place once lost: the Philippines. On the island of Luzon, one of the largest and bloodiest battles of the Pacific would soon begin. It was more than just a return to lost ground. It was the fulfillment of a promise: we shall return. Four years after Japan seized the Philippines, darkness still hung over the islands. The war only began to turn when the Allied forces, led by the United States, achieved a decisive victory at Leyte in late 1944. It was a triumph that rekindled hope for freedom, yet it was still not enough to liberate the entire nation. For General Douglas MacArthur, the American commander who had been forced to leave the islands in the darkest days of the war and vowed to return, the campaign for Luzon was more than just a military operation. It was a promise of honor that had to be fulfilled. Luzon, the largest island of the Philippines, home to the capital Manila, with its deep water ports and vital airfields, was the key that would unlock the road straight to Japan. But on the other side, Field Marshal Tomoyuki Yamashita, the so-called Tiger of Malaya, was also preparing for the inevitable confrontation with the United States. After his crushing defeat at Leyte, Yamashita knew Japan could no longer match America's overwhelming power in open battle. Instead, he turned to a strategy of prolonged defense, withdrawing his forces to the northern and eastern regions of Luzon and building strongholds deep within the rugged Cordillera and Sierra Madre Mountains, where the terrain itself could serve as his fortress. His goal was simple: to bog down American forces, forcing them to pay in blood for every inch of ground on the long road toward Tokyo. But MacArthur had planned every move. Before launching the main invasion of Luzon, he needed a forward base from which American aircraft could dominate the skies and protect the fleet. In December 1944, under Brigadier General William Dunkel, the U.S. Western Task Force carried out a lightning assault on the sparsely populated island of Mindoro. Within days, troops of the 19th Infantry Regiment and the 503rd Parachute Regiment had secured the beaches and constructed 2 airstrips, allowing the 5th Air Force to control the air over Luzon and prepare for the great invasion to come. Throughout that month, American reconnaissance planes and Navy minesweepers scoured Lingayen Gulf, while submarines, commandos, and fake paratroopers operations launched a series of deceptive attacks in the south to mislead the enemy. Yet Yamashita was not easily fooled. With his experience and stubborn resolve, he kept his focus where it mattered most, reinforcing the defenses and artillery at Lingayen Gulf, the very place where deep down he knew the United States would return, bringing with it the promise of freedom and the unstoppable strength of America. At dawn on January 9, 1945, the skies over Luzon thundered. as American naval guns unleashed a storm of fire. More than 70 warships and cruisers advanced into Lingayen Gulf, pounding Japanese positions from 7 a.m. At exactly 8 o'clock, landing craft carrying the first assault waves surged toward the beaches. This was the largest amphibious operation ever launched by the United States in the Pacific. Over 175,000 troops of the U.S. 6th Army under Lieutenant General Walter Kruger, including the 1st and 14th Corps, supported by aircraft carriers, destroyers, artillery, and air cover, stormed across more than 20 miles of shoreline. Unlike the narrow, deadly beaches of Normandy, Lingayen offered broad, calm waters, but the Japanese had turned the hills and villages beyond into fortresses. Before the landing craft could even reach shore, waves of kamikaze pilots descended from the sky. Between January 3rd and 13th, hundreds of Japanese suicide planes struck the American fleet, sinking or damaging 47 vessels, including the escort carrier USS Amine Bay. Yet despite the chaos, the Americans held firm. Dense anti-aircraft fire and unshakable determination kept the fleet intact, ensuring the landings could continue. Once the beachhead was secured, the 6th Army split into two drives. The I Corps, under Lieutenant General Innes P. Swift, moved north to cut off Japanese retreat routes into the Cordillera Mountains, while the 14th Corps, led by Lieutenant General Oscar W. Griswold, advanced south through the Central Plains toward Manila. In the opening days, resistance was surprisingly light. The 37th and 40th Divisions pushed through the rice fields of Tarlac, Moncada, and Cameling, greeted by villagers cheering through tears as American soldiers marched past. The liberators had returned. But soon, the first major challenge emerged at Clark Field, the strategic airbase nestled among the western hills. U.S. intelligence had estimated only 4,000 to 8,000 defenders, but the reality was far grimmer. Nearly 30,000 Japanese troops from the Kembu Group, including 8,500 elite soldiers armed with artillery, machine guns, and fortified bunkers. The rough terrain made progress slow. Enemy guns hidden in caves swept the runways with deadly fire. Step by step, American forces advanced, calling in heavy artillery and M7 howitzer tanks for support. Only by the end of January did they finally secure the entire area. Farther north, the I Corps faced a formidable armored opponent, the Japanese 2nd Tank Division, or Geki Force. They had transformed the town of San Manuel into a stronghold, concealing 45 Type 97 and Type 95. On January 19th, an American reconnaissance unit was met with fierce fire. General Kruger ordered a 5-day artillery barrage before sending in the infantry. On January 24th, the 161st Regiment of the 25th Division entered the town, losing 6 Sherman tanks in the opening assault. But with mortar and M7 howitzer support, they gradually pushed through the streets. Fighting raged house to house, street to street. American troops advanced under the cover of smoke grenades, silencing enemy guns one by one. By January 28th, as 13 Japanese tanks tried to break out, American bazookas and 37mm anti-tank guns destroyed 10 of them. Over 775 Japanese soldiers were killed, with only about 400 escaping. The Americans lost 60 men and 200 wounded. But the victory at San Manuel opened the road toward the Baguio Highlands and secured a firm foothold for the liberation of Luzon. In January 1945, one of the most remarkable American operations in the Philippines was the Cabanatuan prison camp raid. After the Palawan massacre in December 1944, General Douglas MacArthur feared that over 500 American and Filipino prisoners held at Cabanatuan would be executed before Allied forces could reach them. Major Russell Volkmann, working alongside Filipino guerrillas, proposed a daring plan, a combined operation between U.S. Rangers and local resistance fighters to strike deep behind enemy lines. On the evening of January 30th, 90 Rangers from the 6th Ranger Battalion, 80 guerrillas from the Huck Resistance and 2 Alamo scout teams crossed a river and crept through the jungle toward the camp. They placed sniper teams to cut off enemy reinforcements and used a red flare as the signal to attack. Overhead, a P-61 Black Widow dropped napalm near the area to draw Japanese attention away. As darkness fell, the raiders stormed the camp, killing the guards, destroying the searchlights, and freeing 512 prisoners, both soldiers and civilians. Emaciated and sick, many were carried to safety on ox-drawn carts under the moonlight, escorted by local guerrillas. The entire operation succeeded with minimal casualties, a flawless rescue that proved the effectiveness of American Special Forces working hand in hand with Filipino fighters. To support the main advance and cut Yamashita's supply lines, the U.S. 11th Corps launched a second amphibious landing on January 15th along Luzon's western coast. The 38th Infantry Division and 34th Regiment came ashore in Zambales province almost unopposed. Local guerrillas had already captured San Marcelino airfield and helped the Americans secure the port of Olongapo by January 30th. From there, the troops pushed east along Route 7, cutting through dense jungle toward the Zigzag Pass, Horseshoe Bend. Between early February and February 14th, the 152nd Regiment fought around the clock to break through a maze of tunnels and fortified high ground. By February 21st, the Bataan Peninsula, the site of America's painful surrender in 1942, was fully liberated. The U.S. flag once again flew over the same ground where so many Americans had suffered, marking both redemption and the reopening of the western approach to Manila Bay. Meanwhile, in southern Luzon, the 11th Airborne Division of the 14th Corps under Major General Joseph Swing prepared to strike Manila from the south. On January 31st, the vanguard, the 188th Glider Infantry Regiment, landed at Nasugbu Beach, supported by a 20 Havoc and P-38 Lightning aircraft. They quickly secured the town and bridges, paving the way for the 187th Glider Infantry Regiment to come ashore. On February 3rd, C-47 transports dropped 511 paratroopers from the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment over the Tagaytay Ridge. Though some were scattered by strong winds, they regrouped within hours and seized key positions on the high ground. From there, the 11th Airborne launched a rapid assault northward, breaking through the Genco Line, a defensive network of trenches and bunkers guarding Manila's southern approaches. Within days, they captured Nichols Field on February 12th and Fort McKinley on February 13th, cutting off the Japanese escape route to the south. In northern Luzon, the U.S. 14th Corps, under Lieutenant General Walter Kruger, together with the 1st Cavalry Division and the 37th Infantry Division, launched a full-scale offensive toward Manila. General Douglas MacArthur urged his commanders to move quickly. He wanted the capital liberated before his wife's birthday. On January 26, 1945, Kruger ordered the 37th Division to cross the Pampanga River and advance along Highway 3 toward San Fernando and Calumpit. By January 30th, reconnaissance units had built pontoon bridges and seized key crossings. Under MacArthur's personal pressure, Kruger pushed the 1st Cavalry Division forward for a rapid assault. On the night of February 2nd to 3rd, mechanized cavalry units broke through Japanese lines, driving swiftly down Route 7 and bursting into the outskirts of Manila. The vanguard of the 8th Cavalry Regiment crossed Quiapo Bridge, reached the University of Santo Tomas, and freed more than 4,000 foreign prisoners by 8 p.m. The next morning, thousands of Manila residents flooded the streets, cheering through tears as American armored vehicles rolled past, a moment of pure liberation after 3 years of darkness. But freeing Manila would come at a terrible price. Defending the city was Rear Admiral Sanji Iwabuchi, commander of the Yokosuka 31st Naval Force, with roughly 12,000 Japanese Marines. Despite Yamashita's order to withdraw, Iwabuchi and his officers vowed to fight to the death to preserve their honor. From February 3rd onward, brutal street fighting erupted. From the north, the 1st Cavalry and 37th Divisions tried to cross the Pasig River, but the Japanese had destroyed the bridges, forcing American troops to slog through swamps and build pontoon crossings under heavy fire. The Japanese had turned every building, every school, and even hospitals into bunkers, rigged with mines, booby traps, and explosives. They massacred civilians in one of the most horrific atrocities of the Pacific War, the Manila Massacre. It wasn't until March 3rd, after American 155mm artillery and naval guns from Manila Bay leveled the Intramuros district, that the last pockets of resistance were wiped out. The month-long battle left the capital in ruins, and between 100,000 and 120,000 civilians were killed. A staggering human tragedy amid victory. While the fight for Manila raged, U.S. forces carried out another operation, the recapture of Corregidor, a mission heavy with symbolism and pride. The small island guarding the entrance to Manila Bay, known as the Rock, had been the site of America's bitter surrender in 1942. This time, MacArthur vowed it would be reclaimed. The assault would be a dual invasion, by air and by sea. From late January to mid-February, American bombers and artillery poured thousands of tons of explosives onto the island, reducing its defenses to rubble. On February 16th, hundreds of paratroopers from the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment jumped onto Topside Hill in fierce winds. Many were blown off the cliffs, but held their ground and opened fire. At the same time, 24th Infantry Division troops landed by sea at San Jose Beach. Japanese defenders launched desperate counterattacks. The fiercest came on February 18th at Banzai Point, when more than 500 Japanese Marines charged uphill screaming their battle cries and were annihilated by American fire. On February 26th, U.S. soldiers raised the stars and stripes atop Malinta Hill, marking the full recapture of Corregidor, the same island where, 3 years earlier, the flag had been lowered in defeat. Meanwhile, in southern Luzon, another daring operation unfolded, the Los Baños Raid, one of the most brilliant rescues of the entire war. From early February, Major General Joseph Swing had been ordered to plan the mission to free more than 2,000 civilian prisoners held in an internment camp near Los Baños. The operation was delayed while the 11th Airborne Division fought at Nichols Field and Fort McKinley, but by February 20th, the plan was complete. A 4-phase, perfectly coordinated assault. According to the plan, a reconnaissance team and local guerrillas would secretly swim across Laguna de Bay at night, eliminate the guards, and signal the main attack. Then Company B of the 1st Battalion, 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment, would parachute into a small drop zone beside the camp and storm the gates. Simultaneously, the rest of the battalion would cross the lake aboard 54 LVT-4 amphibious vehicles to evacuate the prisoners, while the 188th Glider Infantry Regiment and tanks advanced along the highway to block any Japanese counterattack. At 7 a.m. on February 23rd, green parachutes blossomed over Los Baños as gunfire erupted. The recon teams, already in position, silently cut communication lines and killed the guards. Company B stormed the compound, catching the Japanese soldiers in their sleep, while the LVTS roared ashore, blasting bunkers with 75mm guns. In just 1 hour, 2,147 prisoners, men, women, children, and the elderly, were freed and ferried safely across the lake with minimal losses. The Los Baños Raid became one of the most daring and flawlessly executed operations of World War II, showcasing the unmatched coordination and courage of U.S. airborne, naval, and special forces, together with the bravery of Filipino guerrillas. Outside Manila, to the northeast, the city's water supply became a matter of survival. The capital depended entirely on 2 main reservoirs, Novaliches and Ipo. Novaliches, located on the outskirts, had been captured by U.S. forces on February 5th, but it drew its water from Ipoh Dam, situated about 15 kilometers deeper in the Sierra Madre Mountains. Upstream lay Wawa Dam, though it had been disconnected from Manila's water system since 1938. The mountainous terrain surrounding both dams was held by the Japanese Shimbu Group, roughly 35,000 troops under Major General Shizuo Yokoyama. His forces were divided into three commands: the Kawashima Force guarding Ipoh Dam in the north, the Kobayashi Force defending the central sector around Montalban and Wawa, and the Noguchi Force entrenched in the south near Antipolo and the shores of Laguna de Bay. Together, they formed a vast defensive complex known as the Shimbu Fortress, stretching over 30 miles from Ipoh to Wawa, connected by a web of tunnels, caves, and artillery positions. The Japanese had heavily armed the area: mortars, machine guns, 105mm and 155mm field guns, and even 200mm and 447mm rockets. Many caves had up to 10 entrances, fortified with sandbags and expertly camouflaged. Deep inside, Japanese gunners could fire from hidden openings and retreat before counterfire, making them extremely difficult targets for U.S. artillery. In early February, the U.S. 6th Army assigned the task of clearing the Shimbu region to the 14th Corps. But Kruger's forces had already been depleted for other operations, leaving him with only the 6th Infantry Division and the 2nd Cavalry Brigade to assault Wawa and Antipolo before turning toward Ipoh Dam. On February 20th, the 2nd Cavalry Brigade crossed the Marikina River, seizing the towns of Taytay and Taguig almost without resistance. 2 days later, the 6th Division captured Montalban and crossed a 3-kilometer-wide valley with ease. But once they entered the hills of Oro, Pakawagan, Mataba, and Yabang, Japanese fire erupted from every direction. Enemy troops hid in caves, firing bursts before vanishing again, forcing the Americans to counter with napalm and white phosphorus shells to burn away camouflage and flush them out. At Antipolo, the 2nd Cavalry Brigade joined forces with the marking guerrillas and Hunter ROTC units, bombarding Japanese defenses for 2 days before launching their assault on March 8th. Hill after hill fell to American hands, but the cost was steep. 295 Americans killed, while the Noguchi force lost over 3,300 men. On March 14th, Major General Edwin Patrick, commander of the 6th Division, was killed by a sniper while inspecting the front lines. Still, the offensive succeeded in driving a wedge between the Noguchi and Kobayashi forces, forcing Yokoyama to withdraw his troops from the southern sector. By March, fighting along the Shimbu line reached a new level of brutality. General Griswold decided to attack Wawa first, then move on to Ipoh. The 6th Infantry Division and 1st Cavalry Brigade took turns assaulting fortified positions, while American artillery fired phosphorus and napalm shells to create smoke cover for advancing troops. Flamethrowers and bazookas silenced cave after cave. On March 11th, cavalry troops captured the Antipolo Heights, though the 6th Division's left flank remained pinned down by Japanese mortars and machine guns. The following weeks were a nightmare. The men fought through blood-soaked trenches, slept in mosquito-infested caves, and endured tropical downpours even during the dry season. According to Triumph in the Philippines, each U.S. regiment lost 55 to 60 men per day, a staggering rate of attrition. Yet they pressed on relentlessly. On March 24th, the 43rd Division seized Mount Yabang. 3 days later, on March 27th, the 6th Division captured Mount Baytangan and pushed deeper into the jungle. Once Antipolo was secured, General Kruger turned his focus to the ultimate objective, Ipoh Dam. He knew that only when the waters of the Angat River flowed again into Manila could the city truly come back to life. However, General MacArthur, still believing Wawa Dam was the main source, sent an urgent message asking, "When will you take Wawa?" Kruger had to clarify that Wawa had been out of service since 1938 and that Ipoh supplied 1/3 of Manila's water. By mid-April, the 43rd Division moved north to prepare for the assault on Ipoh, while the 38th Division took over the southern front. Despite the reinforcements, Kruger's forces remained stretched thin. He had lost the 6th Division to operations in Zambales and had to divert men elsewhere. To fill the gap, he enlisted the help of the marking guerrillas. About 3,000 local fighters led by former bus driver Marcus Marking, Augustine, and his courageous wife, Ye Panlilio. These guerrillas, familiar with every mountain trail and river crossing, guided American troops through the dense jungle and carried out diversionary attacks. Their knowledge and bravery proved invaluable as the U.S. Army prepared for the decisive battle to capture Ipoh Dam, the lifeline that would restore Manila to the living. The plan to capture Ipoh Dam was drawn up with precision and care. According to the operation outline, the 103rd Infantry Regiment would lead the main assault, advancing along the Catatinga Ridge about 4 miles from the dam, then following the ridge line downward toward the target. On the left flank, the 172nd Regiment would swing around Osboy Ridge to cut off Japanese supply routes, while the 169th Regiment carried out a diversionary attack along Metropolitan Road to draw enemy fire. Meanwhile, the Marking Regiment, made up of Filipino guerrillas, was divided into 2 detachments. The northern force would climb Mount Cabuyao, and the southern force would move along the Angat River Valley, guiding and supporting the Americans. Before the ground assault, the U.S. 5th Air Force launched one of the largest napalm bombardments of the entire Southwest Pacific campaign, dropping 250,000 gallons of the incendiary fuel, the heaviest use of napalm in the theater up to that time. For 3 days in early May, hundreds of B-25, P-38, and P-51 aircraft bombed relentlessly, burning out caves, ridges, and artillery positions. The devastation was so intense that Japanese anti-aircraft crews were forced to withdraw temporarily, allowing U.S. reconnaissance planes to survey the area freely. The bombing even fooled General Kawashima, who believed the main attack would hit Wawa, and he ordered his troops south, exposing his northern flank completely. On the night of May 6th to 7th, 1945, the assault on Ipoh Dam began. Under cover of darkness, American infantry silently moved into position to maintain secrecy. White phosphorus shells from the artillery lit up the night sky as troops climbed steep jungle trails, cutting through vines and scrambling over rock ledges. By dawn, the 103rd Regiment had advanced to within 5 kilometers of the dam, while the 172nd Regiment fought through rough terrain toward Bigti and Osboy Ridge. In the north, the Marking guerrillas marched 7 miles without resistance. The Japanese never expected a night attack. The following morning, the 169th Regiment launched a feint along Metropolitan Road, drawing heavy Japanese artillery and machine gun fire and allowing the other 2 regiments to flank from both sides. From May 7th to 11th, American forces advanced steadily through torrential rain and deadly crossfire, gaining only a few hundred meters each day. Then, on May 16th and 17th, waves of P-47s and P-38s returned, unleashing massive napalm strikes and fragmentation bombs that turned the Japanese positions into a blazing inferno. Infantrymen scaled the bomb-scarred cliffs using bamboo ladders, seizing one high point after another. On the night of May 13th, as the Japanese lines crumbled, the Marking guerrillas waded across the Angat River under cover of darkness. By 1:30 p.m. on May 17th, they raised the American flag over the hydroelectric plant south of the dam. Ipoh Dam was now in U.S. hands. Strangely, despite wiring the facility with hundreds of kilograms of explosives, the Japanese never detonated them, perhaps due to confusion, exhaustion, or the sheer pressure of the bombing. 3 days later, Metropolitan Road was cleared, Engineers swept the last tunnels for hidden mines, and Wawa Dam was also secured. By May 1945, water from the Angat River once again flowed into Manila, saving millions of civilians suffering from drought and devastation. While 14th Corps battled the Shimbu Line, 1st Corps continued its relentless pursuit of General Yamashita's Shobu Group in northern Luzon. The 33rd, 37th, 43rd, and 25th Divisions pushed through the treacherous mountain passes of Balete, Salaksak, and Dalton. Across the Cordillera Range, Yamashita had transformed the highlands into natural fortresses, peaks carved into bunkers, tunnels, and artillery nests. Most of his remaining men were conscripts from the shattered 14th Army, and they were determined to fight to the death. From March through May 1945, the battle for Balit Pass became one of the bloodiest engagements of the Luzon campaign. The narrow corridor earned the grim nickname the Abbey of Bones, as corpses piled up amid shattered rocks and jungle mud. The Americans deployed bulldozers, 155mm artillery, and rockets, using tactics to lure Japanese troops out of their caves before striking with grenades and flamethrowers. Despite their losses, Yamashita's soldiers held out until August 1945, when Japan finally surrendered. The fierce resistance in the mountains kept many U.S. divisions tied down in Luzon far longer than expected, but it also gave them invaluable experience in mountain and jungle warfare, lessons that would soon prove crucial in the final and most brutal battles of the Pacific, especially Okinawa. By the summer of 1945, the fighting on Luzon had finally begun to subside. The remaining Japanese forces had retreated deep into the mountains and jungles, breaking into scattered groups that resisted sporadically but hopelessly. American troops and Filipino guerrillas shifted their focus to mopping up operations, hunting down isolated units, and restoring security to newly liberated regions. On September 2nd, 1945, Japan formally signed the Instrument of Surrender aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, officially ending World War II. Shortly afterward, General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the infamous Tiger of Malaya, surrendered at Kiangan in Ifugao Province, marking the end of nearly 8 months of fierce combat on Luzon. According to Allied reports, the campaign had wiped out more than 205,000 Japanese soldiers and captured over 9,000 prisoners of war. American forces suffered approximately 10,640 killed and 36,550 wounded, while an estimated 120,000 to 140,000 Filipino civilians, most of them in the Manila Massacre, lost their lives. The Battle of Luzon was the largest U.S. campaign in the Pacific Theater, involving 10 divisions and 5 independent regiments, an operation unmatched in scale anywhere else in the Southwest Pacific. For General Douglas MacArthur, the victory on Luzon was far more than a strategic triumph. It was the fulfillment of a promise. He had returned, liberated the Philippines, and severed Japan's vital supply lines from Southeast Asia. The recapture of Luzon and Manila carried immense political, military, and emotional significance. It ended 4 years of brutal occupation, paved the way for the restoration of the Philippine government, and provided a massive forward base for the upcoming campaigns at Okinawa and potentially Kyushu, in preparation for an invasion of the Japanese homeland. The battles of San Manuel, Clark Field, Nichols Field, Corregidor, Bataan, Manila, Antipolo, and Ipoh tested the full coordination of America's Army, Navy, Air Force, and Special Operations units. They also highlighted the extraordinary courage of Filipino guerrillas, U.S. soldiers, engineers, medical personnel, and civilians who together endured hunger, destruction, and death in the pursuit of freedom. As the smoke cleared over Luzon, the Pacific War entered its final chapter. From the waters of the Coral Sea to the jungles of Guadalcanal, and the shores of the Philippines, hundreds of thousands had fallen to turn the tide of history. These victories were not born from technology or luck, but from the endurance of those who believed that freedom was worth dying for. 3 years, 3 battlefields, one path, the road back, step by step, across oceans, through fire, and through blood. When the American flag rose over Manila, the world realized the Japanese Empire was no longer invincible. And from those tiny islands scattered across the Pacific, the road to the end of World War II had begun. This is not just a story of victory. It is the story of those who stood back up when the world believed they had already fallen.